Imagine a man named Robert, nothing extraordinary about him. No trust fund, no six-figure inheritance, no lucky stock picks, just a hardworking middle-class American who believed in doing the responsible thing. For nearly 40 years, Robert followed the same financial habit. Every month, he saved money, not occasionally, not when it was convenient, every single month. When he was young, the amount was small. As his income grew, the amount grew too. By the time he reached his early 60s, he had accumulated a substantial amount of money. Friends admired his discipline. Family members described him as financially responsible. And they were right. Robert was responsible. But there was one problem. His money had spent decades sitting still, protected, preserved, saved, yet almost entirely disconnected from the one force that creates substantial wealth, growth. When Robert finally sat down to calculate what his savings could actually provide in retirement, he experienced something millions of people experience every year. Confusion. The numbers looked large, but the future they could support looked surprisingly small. And that's when he discovered something that changed the way he thought about money forever. Saving had protected his wealth, but it had never truly multiplied it. This is where many people accidentally fall into a financial trap. Because from childhood, we're taught that saving money is the goal. Dawkins teach it. Schools teach it. Financial institutions encourage it. And to be clear, saving is important. Without saving, wealth building cannot begin. But saving is the starting line, not the finish line. Imagine planting a seed. You carefully place it into fertile soil. You water it. You protect it. You make sure nothing damages it. That's important. But if the seed never grows into a tree, then all you've really done is preserve a seed. Money works in a remarkably similar way. A dollar saved is valuable. But a dollar that remains productive for decades becomes something entirely different. Jack Bogle understood this better than almost anyone. He often reminded investors that the greatest advantage available to ordinary people wasn't intelligence. It wasn't market timing. It wasn't predicting economic events. It was allowing compounding to work uninterrupted over long periods of time. Compounding is one of those concepts people hear constantly but rarely feel because it starts slowly, painfully slowly. In the beginning, it seems almost insignificant, a small gain, a modest increase, nothing that changes your life, which is exactly why so many people underestimate it. Human beings naturally focus on immediate results. We like visible progress. We like quick rewards. Compounding offers neither. For years, it appears to do very little. Then gradually, something extraordinary begins to happen. The growth starts generating growth. Then that growth begins generating even more growth. And eventually, the snowball becomes large enough that its momentum exceeds anything your personal savings alone could have achieved. This is where the distinction between saving and wealth building becomes impossible to ignore. Saving depends entirely on your effort. Wealth building eventually benefits from accumulated effort. One requires continuous labor, the other creates leverage. And leverage is one of the defining characteristics of wealth. The irony is that many people spend decades searching for shortcuts while completely overlooking the most reliable wealth-building mechanism ever discovered, time. Not exciting, not glamorous, not something that creates headlines, but extraordinarily powerful. Decades ago, Bogle noticed something fascinating. Many investors spend enormous amounts of energy trying to outperform the market, trying to predict the next winner, trying to identify the next opportunity before everyone else. Meanwhile, some of the most successful investors simply remained invested, patently, consistently, allowing time to accomplish what brilliance often could not. That observation bothered a lot of people because it wasn't exciting. But it was true. And sometimes the most valuable financial lessons are also the least entertaining. Which brings us to another misunderstanding that quietly keeps people from building wealth. People often confuse safety with certainty. Those are not the same thing. A savings account feels certain. You can see the balance. You know exactly what's there. Nothing appears to be changing, and that certainty creates comfort. But comfort and wealth are not always traveling in the same direction, because while money sits still, the world does not. Prices change, businesses grow, economies evolve, assets appreciate, innovation creates new value. And money that remains disconnected from those forces gradually loses its ability to participate in them. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. And that's the danger. The biggest financial threats are rarely dramatic. They are gradual, just like the accumulation of wealth itself. The person who spends recklessly often sees consequences quickly. The person who saves diligently but never allows money to grow may not recognize the consequences until decades later. By then, the opportunity cost has become enormous. And opportunity cost is one of the most invisible forces in personal finance. Most people focus on what they lost. Very few focus on what they never gained. But the money you never earned can become far larger than the money you lost. That's the part many people never calculate. And it's the part that quietly separates savers from wealth builders. But here's where the conversation becomes even more important, because the biggest reason people struggle to build wealth isn't a lack of knowledge. It's psychology. And the psychological mistake that causes more financial damage than almost any market crash is something most people don't even realize they're doing. And that's where the story becomes truly interesting. The psychological mistake is surprisingly simple. People become addicted to feeling financially safe, not being financially safe, feeling financially safe. And those two things can be very different. Think about how most people evaluate financial decisions. They ask questions like, will I lose money? Could something go wrong? What if the market falls? What if there's a recession? Those are reasonable questions. In fact, they should be asked. But there is another question that is often ignored, a question that may be even more important. What is the cost of doing nothing? Because doing nothing has a cost too, and that cost can become enormous over time. Imagine two neighbors. Both are cautious. Both want security. Both want a comfortable retirement. The first spends decades protecting every dollar from short-term volatility. The second accepts temporary uncertainty in exchange for long-term ownership of productive assets. Neither path feels dramatic in the beginning. In fact, during difficult years, the first person often feels smarter. When markets fall, they feel relieved. When headlines become frightening, they feel justified. When others panic, they feel protected. And for a while, that protection feels rewarding. But then something interesting happens. Years pass, businesses continue producing. Economies continue growing. Innovation continues creating value. And the ownership of those productive assets compounds. Meanwhile, the person who chose certainty discovers that avoiding volatility and avoiding risk are not always the same thing, because the greatest financial risk is not always losing money. Sometimes it's failing to grow it. Jack Bogle often challenged investors to think differently about risk. Most people define risk as temporary declines. Bogle frequently viewed risk through a much longer lens. To him, the greater danger was failing to participate in long-term economic growth, because retirement is not funded by feelings. It is funded by purchasing power, and purchasing power comes from ownership. This is where many people unknowingly make a costly trade. They sacrifice future freedom in exchange for present comfort. And the trade feels reasonable because nobody experiences the loss immediately. Nobody wakes up one morning and sees a notification saying, you have just lost 20 years of potential compounding. The loss is invisible. It occurs slowly, quickly, year after year, until eventually the gap becomes impossible to ignore. This is why wealth building often feels unnatural. Human beings evolved to solve immediate problems. We are wired to prioritize today's certainty over tomorrow's possibility. Yet wealth is built by doing precisely the opposite, by making decisions that may not feel rewarding today, but become extraordinarily valuable later. Warren Buffett once described wealth as the transfer of purchasing power through time. That idea sounds simple, but think about what it really means. Money is not merely something you spend. It is stored effort, stored opportunity, stored choices. Every dollar represents a piece of your life, a piece of your labor, a piece of your time. And the question every person eventually faces is this: will that stored effort remain idle? Or will it continue working after you stop? That question determines far more than most people realize. Because eventually everyone reaches a point where they want something money alone cannot buy. Time with family, time without financial stress, time without the constant pressure of earning, time to choose how each day is spent. And that is where wealth and income finally separate. Income requires your presence. Wealth continues working when you're absent. The person earning a large paycheck may appear successful. The person quietly accumulating productive assets may actually be becoming free. And freedom is the destination most people are searching for, even when they call it something else. But before we finish, there's one final lesson that Jack Bogle spent decades trying to teach. And in many ways, it may be the most important lesson of all, because it explains why so many intelligent people understand investing, yet still fail to build meaningful wealth. The lesson is patience, not intelligence, not market predictions, not finding the next big opportunity. Patience. And that's difficult for many people to accept because patience feels passive. It feels like doing nothing. It feels too simple. Yet, when Jack Bogle looked across decades of market history, he kept arriving at the same conclusion. The greatest advantage available to ordinary investors was not superior knowledge, it was superior behavior. That distinction matters. And because knowledge is surprisingly common, behavior is rare. Most people already know they should spend less than they earn. Most people already know they should save. Most people already know they should think long term. The challenge isn't understanding those ideas. The challenge is continuing to follow them when emotions begin pulling in the opposite direction. When markets rise rapidly and everyone around you appears to be getting rich. When headlines create fear. When uncertainty dominates the news cycle. When patience feels foolish. When discipline feels lonely. That's when behavior matters most. Bogle often noticed that investors treated investing like a prediction contest. They wanted certainty. They wanted reassurance. They wanted someone to tell them exactly what would happen next. But markets don't reward certainty. They reward ownership. The future has always been uncertain. It was uncertain in 1973. It was uncertain in 1987. It was uncertain in 2000. It was uncertain in 2008. And it will remain uncertain long after all of us are gone. Yet despite all that uncertainty, productive businesses continued creating value. People continued buying goods. Families continued needing services, innovation continued solving problems, and patient owners continued benefiting from that progress. That's the part many people miss. Wealth is not built because uncertainty disappears. Wealth is built because productive assets continue functioning despite uncertainty. And once you understand that, an interesting shift begins to happen. You stop asking, what will happen next year? And you start asking, what is likely to matter 20 years from now? That question leads to very different decisions. It shifts attention away from noise, away from predictions, away from short-term emotions, and toward ownership, toward patience, toward compounding, toward the things that have historically created wealth across generations. The truth is, saving money is a wonderful habit. Every wealthy person I have ever studied understood the importance of saving. But saving alone was never the destination. It was merely the bridge between earning money and putting money to work. And that may be the most important financial lesson of all. Money has two jobs. The first is to protect you. The second is to grow beyond you. Most people spend their lives focused entirely on the first job. The people who build meaningful wealth learn how to balance both. They create security without sacrificing growth. They seek protection without abandoning opportunity. And most importantly, they understand that wealth is not measured by how much money sits still. It's measured by how much productive ownership they accumulate over time. Because at the end of the day, nobody really wants a large savings account. What people actually want is what that account represents. Freedom choices, independence, peace of mind, the ability to spend time with the people they love, the ability to wake up and decide what happens next. And those outcomes are rarely created by saving alone. They are created when saving becomes the first step in a much larger process, a process built on ownership, patience, discipline, and time. So perhaps the real question isn't whether you're saving enough. Perhaps the more important question is this. After you've saved the money, what is that money doing for you? Leave a comment below and tell me your answer. And if you enjoy thoughtful conversations about wealth building, investing, financial freedom, and the timeless lessons of Jack Bogle, Warren Buffett, and Charlie Munger, subscribe to Quiet Wealth Method. Because the biggest financial breakthroughs rarely come from discovering something new. More often, they come from finally understanding something that was hiding in plain sight all along.